Good morning, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Hope you had a good weekend. Welcome to week 12 of our semester, and I guess week 3 of our experiment in online teaching. So, as you know, I'm a week behind, so I was going to post these slides last week and just didn't have the time to do it, so I apologize. But hopefully we'll get caught up a little bit, caught up-ish, I guess. That'll be our goal. So these slides kind of go along with the activity that you did last week, where you looked at the productivity of different forest cover types in the eastern U.S. And so as I go through these slides, you'll kind of see how those different forest cover types play out as we look kind of at their distribution across the eastern U.S. There is a quiz associated with these slides, so you can kind of look at that quiz and maybe go through the slides at the same time and just answer questions as you go through the slides. And I'll make sure that the questions in the quiz, kind of go in the same order as the slides do. Because again, it's not really testing your memorization of the material, it's just helping you identify the important components of these slides and the material. So I've got quite a few slides to go through. I've been trying to keep the videos short. This one's going to be a bit longer, but again, you can kind of pause it as you are answering questions in the quiz. So let's get going. We looked at this slide last week, just kind of the distribution of the different forest cover types in the eastern US. And then remember, we kind of talked briefly about these different physiographic regions that are in the eastern US. And so as I go through the slides today, we'll kind of be focusing on these different physiographic regions. You saw this slide already, and I think you saw this slide, but I want you to be familiar with this ranking of productivity. These are the 10 most common forest cover types in the eastern US, and which ones are the most productive to the least productive. And so we'll come back to this slide a little bit, but just kind of be familiar with this ranking. Okay, the other thing I mentioned I wanted you to take away from this, kind of what you did last week and the slides this week, is not just memorizing where these different forest cover types occur in the eastern US, but thinking about what conditions they occur in to help you reason which forest cover type you might expect in a certain region. And so what I've got in this slide is kind of we've got 4 abiotic stressors that the forest cover types can tolerate. And so we'll talk through these, and then in each category I have 3 or 4 forest cover types. So let's start with the first one being either really cold temperatures or more likely a short growing season. And so places where we're going to have really cold temperatures or short growing season are going to be primarily in the northern regions of the eastern US, or potentially at higher elevations in the Appalachian Mountains. And so I kind of have these in order of the ranking, but I hesitate to actually assign a ranked number because some of them are really hard to know the difference between. So generally speaking, spruce fir forests are the most tolerant of cold and short growing seasons, followed by red white jack pine and aspen birch stands. And these two are separated by kind of the soil moisture availability. So in the wetter places, you tend to find aspen birch. In the drier places, you find red white jack pine. And then the forest cover type that is still tolerant of a short growing season, but less so than those 3, is a maple beech birch forest. So anytime you start to get a short growing season, likely you're going to see some maple beech birch showing up. Maple beech birch, though, they're kind of the forest cover type that grows really, really fast, but can't handle a lot of other stress tolerators. So anytime it gets dry, you tend to move to a red white jack pine or maybe one of the oak forests. Anytime it gets a little bit too wet, you might get the aspen birch showing up. And anytime it gets a little bit colder, you get more of the spruce fir. Okay, so fire and drought I've combined. Even though they're independent stressors, they tend to go along together. So I just kind of lumped them together. The forest cover types that are the most fire and drought tolerant tend to be the 2 different pine forests that are listed. So let's just go back up to that slide real quick. Those are the longleaf slash pine and then the loblolly shortleaf pine. Those are the two forest cover types, or pine forest cover types in the southern U.S. that are, and they're both really fire and drought tolerant. Next would be the oak pine forest. So this is where you get gymnosperms mixed pretty evenly with angiosperms or oaks. And then lastly would be the oak hickory forests. And oaks in general, so oaks are a really diverse genus, and they can tolerate lots of different conditions. But in general, when we think of drought conditions, oaks do a really good job at tolerating seasonal drought, whereas pines are kind of more persistent drought. And so places more to the west of the Appalachians where you get this really, fairly pronounced dry season, that's where the oaks tend to show up a little bit more. Okay, and then for flooding, so we see places in the eastern U.S. that are maybe flooded almost seasonally or all year long, so annually or maybe seasonally. So oak gum cypress tends to be the forest cover type that is most tolerant of flooding, and so you find this forest cover type where it might be flooded all the time, so standing water all year long. Then elm ash cottonwood is also a forest cover type that is good at tolerating flooding conditions. Usually it's not flooded all year long where you find elm ash cottonwood, but it can be prolonged flooding. And then aspen birch forest can handle some flooding as well, and they do good in those wetter places. And then longleaf slash pine, we don't generally think of pines as being tolerant of flooding, and so really it's not so much that it's tolerant of flooding, it can handle wetter sites than the other pine forest. So there's a loblolly shortleaf pine forest that we're going to talk about as well. That needs to be on drier sites, whereas the longleaf slash pine can handle some wet sites. So if you're hiking in the southeast in areas where you might see lots of oak gum cypress where it's really wet, when you move to the upland areas where it's just a little bit drier, that's where you'll see that longleaf and slash pine forest. All right, so knowing kind of what type of conditions a forest cover type can tolerate can help us kind of think about where that forest cover type might be located. And so keep that in mind as we move through it and talk about these slides. All right, so I'm going to just go through the different physiographic regions. I just remembered one thing. This software I'm using can only record 15 minutes at a time. So there'll definitely be more than one video. So I'll have a part 1, 2, and maybe a part 3. Hopefully we get it done in 30 minutes. So just be aware of that. Then one other thing about the physiographic regions, I've combined a couple physiographic regions that I didn't combine in that data set I gave you to analyze. So just be aware of that, and I'll try to point that out. So to start with, I'm kind of starting at the north, not kind of, actually starting at the north, and I'm combining the St. Lawrence Valley and the New England Maritime. So really we're talking about the very northern parts of the U.S., really Maine, and maybe the northern parts of like New Hampshire, Vermont, Pennsylvania kind of area. And so just thinking about the landscape so you get a feel for what it might look like a little bit, there's lots of kind of rolling hills and depressions where there's lakes and poorly drained areas. And that's in large part because this area was glaciated several times. And when those glaciers like receded primarily, they kind of like scraped the landscape smooth. So it's almost like sandpaper and smoothing out the landscape. So we don't have these really steep valleys and kind of cliffs, but more rolling hills and some depressions. So just thinking about the climate, here's a couple climate diagrams. Notice that precip is uniformly distributed throughout the year, so we don't have prolonged or distinct dry seasons. But of course, we're really cold temperatures because we're that far north, and so the forest cover types are limited by the growing season length. Keep in mind, I think I mentioned this before, but deciduous forest cover types need about 4 months of good growing season in order to outcompete evergreen gymnosperms. And so we're right in the area where the growing season is too short for angiosperms to actually outcompete gymnosperms. And we'll see that in the forest cover types here in just a second. Or actually, how about right now? So the main forest cover types kind of vary by location within this region. And so the coldest places, so either the furthest north or the highest in elevation, are going to be dominated by spruce fir. So that's obviously an evergreen gymnosperm forest. Anytime you move a little bit south or lower elevation and it gets a little bit warmer, that's where you're going to see maple beech birch show up. In poorly drained areas where neither of these can do as well, then you have an aspen birch or aspen birch beech forest showing up. And then on the most well-drained sites, so kind of when it's sandy and a lot of that moisture drains out, you tend to have red, white, and jack pine forests. So those are the four main forest cover types that you see. And in your analysis of Vermont and Maine, when you looked at the ranking of the productivity of different forest cover types, those should have been the four that showed up for that analysis. And one other thing I just want to point out is that these forests in this kind of northeast region of the US are referred to as transitional forests because they transition from eastern deciduous forests to the boreal forests. And so I just have one picture, I think, here that kind of shows where that transition is happening. I took this picture when I was hiking in New Hampshire. And so you can see the colors changing for those eastern deciduous trees, but then some of these spruce and fir trees showing up as we transition from eastern deciduous to boreal forest. Okay, let's talk about the Adirondacks before I might pause it and move to part 2. So in the Adirondacks, this is going to be a little bit further west of where we were just talking about. And in this region, we tend to have more mountainous regions and more kind of these steep valleys. And so we have more extreme gradients in conditions for plants to grow. And so the Adirondacks are kind of at the northern tip of the Appalachians. So again, more mountainous kind of landscapes than what we were just talking about. But of course, the climate is going to be exactly the same. Fairly uniform distribution, cold temperatures, and that's what's going to limit the trees you would find here. So we're going to actually end up seeing the exact same forest cover types being the most dominant. So again, higher elevations, more north, you're going to get spruce fir. As you move down in elevation, you're going to get maple beech birch, aspen birch forest, and red white jack pine. Again, the difference between aspen birch and red white jack pine has to do with the soil type. So wetter places that are poorly drained are going to be aspen birch, because remember, they can tolerate a little bit of flooding. The red white jack pine can't tolerate that flooding, and so they're on the drier places. So Adirondacks is very much like the St. Lawrence Valley and the New England Maritime. It's just that the landscape is a little different. So that's all you really need to remember difference-wise between those areas. Okay, I'm going to stop it here, and then I'm going to create another new video, and that will be part 2 of the Eastern U.S. forests.